Welcome to Viewpoint. A fragile ceasefire in Syria is largely holding as it nears the end of its first week. Meanwhile, acts of violence and retaliation continue between Israelis and Palestinians, and Iranians went to the polls in an election which saw some strong gains for moderates. In the midst of presidential election here at home, there are a whole lot of questions about what sort of foreign policy our next commander-in-chief might pursue. Joining me to have this discussion on this and other developments is Ellen Laiposn. She's Distinguished Fellow and President Emeritus of the Stimson Center, where she directs the Middle East Southwest Asia program. She's former Vice Chair of the National Intelligence Council and served on the State Department's policy planning as well as in President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board. And we're in the National Security Agency, National Security Council of President Clinton.
Yes.
I want to discuss an issue related first to your intelligence work, and that is some comments I heard Admiral Mullen make in an interview that he gave, a fairly wide-ranging interview on CNN over the last couple of days, that had to do with issues related to surveillance and security. Are we safer, more secure? Are our rights being protected? One of the issues that came up, of course, was this issue of Apple and law enforcement. Apple refusing to agree to provide a backdoor or to unlock a particular cell phone that was owned by one of the terrorists from San Bernardino. When I first heard that case, I was of the opinion, well, of course, unlock the phone. I mean, these are the baddest guys around right now, and we ought to know what's on their phone. But then the argument got made by Mullen and by others in a very different way. Comment on that, if you wouldn't, where you think this case is going and what it means.
So I think in this technological age, these issues of the trade-offs between using technology for national security and using technology for personal and consumer satisfaction are not going to go away. This, how do you balance the two? When the technology is created in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, the US government then takes that technology and uses it or wants to use it. But guess what? The bad guys are also using the same technology. So how do we balance out the rights of the individual, safety of the country, the interests of the big boys that run these big intelligent systems? And this Apple case is fascinating, and I really don't know how it's going to end up. I thought my first reading was that kind of both parties have to bend a little bit. The U.S. government has to, after the excesses of post 9/11, there is a trust deficit about whether the U.S. government knows when to stop. When does the technology make them think that, well, more is always better? How do they exercise the self-restraint to say, we really need this information, we'd like this information, but it's probably not fair to the American public to be grabbing all that information all the time. And then this information, is privacy and we don't need to touch it. I think in this Apple versus FBI struggle, people don't quite trust the government. Do we really mean it when we say one phone only? Once we have the
Or will this
access,
set the precedent that means that any time law enforcement says, we want to unlock this phone?
And if the FBI could then show up the next day with 1,000 phones that they wanted to tap into. But Apple also has to realize that its success as a great company also requires security. I mean, people have to, they need to live in a free country where people are not worried about terrorism all the time, et cetera. So, I personally think that both sides have to bend a little bit. I think that there's a lot of legal experts who think Apple's on strong ground. And the national security agencies, I think, struggle. They want to grab as much data as they possibly can, but they also know, and this is what Mike Hayden talks about, is, how do we win and sustain the trust of the American people? That in the end, we don't want to lose that quality of American democracy. Now, I think the individual consumer wants their cake and eat it too. They want total privacy and they want total access to the best technology available. And sometimes, you can't assume if you're letting, department stores and Amazon know what your preferences are. Why should you assume that
Which
that
I'm not
same,
especially happy with either.
Yeah, right. I'm not. But why should you assume that the U.S. government shouldn't also be doing data mining of that nature to make sure that, because we now also acknowledge, and I think that FBI Director Comey acknowledged this in his testimony on the Hill in early February, that our greatest terrorist threat is from a homegrown extremist using a cell phone, among other things.
I remember President Clinton, after 9/11, I saw him up in New York at a conference he invited me to come and speak at. And he took me aside at one point and he said, you know what? And then he told me that a company that he knows who does this sort of data collection and direct mail, email and hard mail for Democrats had data mined the credit cards of the 19 terrorists. And he said, you know what we found out? He said they found out that these guys had $500,000 plus in unpaid credit cards. They kept getting new credit cards. So I started thinking after that, who funded the terrorists? We did. The banks did. Right. By them charging and knowing that they weren't going to pay because they were going to commit suicide. The problem, of course, is that the government can't do that, which is what the point Clinton was making. After the Patriot Act was passed, the government can. It can do this sort of widespread data mining to dig up information, which takes away the presumption of innocence. In other words, they will look for evidence to find a crime rather than find a crime and then look for evidence to accuse a guilty person. That's a conundrum.
It's a terrible conundrum. I actually think there are more legal constraints on how the intelligence, what kind of data they can actually look at. They're not actually listening to our phone calls. They're looking for patterns of which phone numbers are, connecting to Pakistan or to some other place where they may have a cause for concern. But that we all live in this data-saturated world now where people don't know how to set the boundaries of what kind of data is usable, is desirable, and where do you just have to acknowledge that you're not going to be able to absorb or analyze all the data that you're collecting. I mean, I think the intelligence community, and George Tenet used to say this back in the 90s, that the speed and the volume of stuff that we can collect now is so far in excess of what we can interpret, exploit, understand. Right. And I think that the individual citizen, feels this discomfort. But sometimes that's a little bit misplaced, I think, because they want all the bells and whistles for their consumer life without completely acknowledging that they are compromising their privacy and their security, even just in their relationship with Amazon and Apple, forget the U.S., as well as the U.S. government.
One other issue in that he raised that I want to ask you about, because it touches, it's tangential to another argument you wrote about in the war on terror, let's not lose our values. And that's the issue of drones. I had been on a panel with General Mullen at the Woodrow Wilson Center a while back, where of the four of us on the panel, I was the one who disagreed with the use of drones, arguing that once you open that door for what amounts to assassination and extrajudicial killing, there's no way to close it. And if we have the capacity to do it today, then Iran does, then Russia does, then in the Middle East, Israel does, and pretty soon Hezbollah will. Everybody will have it too. The question is, do the rules of war, and for us, do the rules of our own, what we claim are our values, do they go out the door? He was, I would say, pretty good, but he left the door, he thought that this was actually a very skilled way of targeting individuals and not an entire group, and the collateral damage was much less. But it avoids, I think, both the constitutional and the larger international law question about what we're doing. I mean, Israel used to do targeted assassinations. We condemn them. Now we do it in a different way with drones. What do you think, and where's the intelligence community on this? Is it something that everybody's comfortable with, or because it's easy and clean and quote unquote clean, are there people raising the issue that this may not be the right way for us to operate?
So I think that your focus on the lethal use of drones is where the predicament arises. I think drones are here to stay. You know, it's just another platform that in some ways is neutral in terms of its applicability. It can be used for all kinds of things. And certainly the intelligence community first got interested in drones just as a data collection platform before they figured out in the Iraq War that you could stick guns on it and really accomplish something and further protect the safety of pilots. When I hear the folks in the national security community talk about drones, they definitely defend even the targeted killings as less collateral damage, they claim, as you said, it's more precise, it's in some ways cleaner. But our tolerance for that loss of innocent life and the notion that we are targeting outside of a traditional battlefield environment, adversaries that we've assigned the death penalty to, I think, again, that raises a kind of a moral anguish in the part of the United States. Rosa Brooks was the co-chair of a study that we did at the Stimson Center last year on drones, and she is an expert on the laws of war, and she said the problem with drones is that, you know, all of the tests that you would use for applicability of the laws of war don't work in the case of drones, that the decisions that have to be made more quickly. They're made by actors that are not physically in the same place. You're not in a battlefield environment. You know, if you're in Yemen or various places where we're using drones, we are no longer in a full-scale combat operations there. So we're using it in very idiosyncratic conditions. So, you know, one of the judgments of our study, which had people from defense, intelligence, the legal world, et cetera, was use them less, use them very selectively, and when you use them, be more transparent about it. I mean, I think one of the ways that we might rebuild some consensus over have we set the right boundaries for the use of this technology would be after the fact to make the case of why we did it. Instead, there's still this nervous secrecy around these drone uses that I think only make people more uncomfortable. So a push for transparency would help, but also, you know, be very selective in the use of these things for the lethal purpose. For the data collection purpose, I think it's just been integrated into the armed forces and the weather agencies of plenty of countries. So that's not going to go away.
And or flying into the White House grounds. Annual threat assessment. It is something that was, if I might say editorially, used to be anticipated and sometimes comes out and is a ho-hum, and other times sends shockwaves. Is it a useful tool, given the fact that it is so obviously scrubbed I mean, if Secretary Clinton's emails have to be gone through to see if there's top secret, the American people generally don't have top secret clearance. So what are we getting when we get the threat assessment, and does it serve a useful political and social function for the country as a whole?
Well, thanks for asking, Jim. I wrote in my column at the World Politics Review this week on trying to push back a little bit on the notion that the whole thing is a waste of time. You know, people might say, oh, it's fear-mongering, it's so predictable, why do we do it? So I'm going to take a slightly more, you know, textured view that it's become an exercise that has certain value to it. It's not the crown jewels of what the intelligence community knows. That obviously is shared in much more discrete channels, and the concerns about, you know, compromising sources and methods would definitely pertain. But for once a year, the heads of the intelligence agencies to have to coordinate on how do we rank the threats and how do we describe to the American people these threats, and the notion that doing it early in the year sort of feeds into a cycle of congressional deliberations, you know, with Congress's control of the purse. Well, should we put a little more money on the cyber side? Should we be recalibrating how much we're funding terrorism activities, et cetera? I think it's pretty high-end, useful policy exercise. not all the detail is going to appear in this public testimony. What I thought was really interesting this year was that the meat of the thing was all about the transnational threats. It wasn't about countries. It wasn't about naming specific bad guys. It was cyber, terror, WMD, space, global public health. It was all those transnational, cross-border things that are not necessarily about two states being mad at each other. Then on the geopolitics side of, how do we think about the threat from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, et cetera, I thought it was pretty weak. And you could almost feel that there were paragraphs that were taken out for classification reasons, and it was kind of a minimalist look at in what specific ways might this country or this region pose a threat to the U.S. But the transnational stuff really shows us how we have to rethink how we organize the intelligence community. And then the last thought was that I think the transparency makes the intelligence community uncomfortable, but now that we've established it, it's not a bad thing for them to get used to communicating with the American public in as honest and comprehensive a way as they can.
If it can't be, though, fully honest and fully comprehensive, i.e. they can't give us all of the material,
right,
is there the danger that, to use a sort of a colloquial expression, that we're being played? Is there the danger of the agencies playing politics in terms of emphasizing threats that are ones they want us to see and de-emphasizing others that they simply aren't ready to confront at this point?
Well, I mean, I think that depends on whether the pre-existing condition is that you should never believe what your government is telling you. If that's the case, then this would be just one more event. But I would think the other danger is that if people say ho-hum, I can probably learn that by watching TV and reading a few newspapers. Does it erode support for such a huge investment in intelligence? And that's where I'm sure the intelligence agency leaders get a little uncomfortable, because they don't want to share the best of their stuff, but they want to make sure that Congress still believes in investing in the service that they provide.
Let's go to Syria for a minute. A truce of sorts, a ceasefire, not a truce, of sorts. And I say of sorts because there have been obvious battles that are still raging, and disputes on both sides as to whether or not the one side is breaking the truce or not, and whether or not the groups involved are themselves covered by the ceasefire. Is this a deal that was made that is so weak in order to get everybody's buy-in so that it can't succeed? Or does this hold open the possibility of a deal that might work?
Well, I would be a little more supportive of how far the U.S.-Russia conversation on Syria has come. You can say, oh my God, we maybe overlap 2% and 98% we are pursuing different agendas. I think it's probably 60-40 or 30-70, that there is some groping together. And if Russia and the U.S. can strengthen that area of common commitment, I think that it will make a difference. It's an agonizing process. There's way too many antagonists and no protagonists. There's so many adversaries there, and as you said, there's still permission to hit at some of them, but not all of them. And
especially when some are allied with others.
Others, yeah. So, I think that we're just also exhausted by the Syrian crisis, that it's too early to be optimistic. I mean, I would not try to paint this in rosy colors at all, but let's not, diminish the achievement of getting the U.S. and Russia and the UN deserves credit. This gentleman over there, is really working awfully hard to push, to nudge all the parties together. The Syrian opposition don't know how to operate at this level. The Assad regime still has friends in high places, so we're not done. But I do think the U.S. shifted gears a little bit and said, the actual regime change piece in Damascus can happen in phase 2. It doesn't happen to happen in phase 1.
This caused some consternation, obviously, in the Arab world, among those who think that it should be phase 1.
Right.
And the U.S. position, I believe, has been altered by the fact that you could have endless bloodshed and not get there. And the question is there a way to create a phased-in set of steps that might lead to this outcome, but not making it a precondition? If the Gulf states, if Saudi Arabia in particular, don't buy into this, if they, as they've been continuing to express their grievances over this this ceasefire, and if they don't trust the U.S. role, they think that the U.S. has allowed Russia to have its way, can this work?
Well, I'm a little mystified by the Arab position, to be honest, because, you know, the intensity with which they now want Assad gone, when, you know, if you turn the clock back a few years, if you think of their anti-Arab Spring point of view, where they would rather incumbent power that they know than the crazy Democrats, you know, coming into power. So early in the Arab Spring, I think they were perfectly fine with Assad surviving, just like they wished that Mubarak had survived, et cetera. But once they switched gears and saw this through the prism of sectarianism, then the passion with which they want Assad to go is quite striking. And there's almost a selective memory loss that if you focus on getting the authoritarian leader out without having properly prepared a succession plan, then, you know, chaos will reign. And they are conveniently forgetting how they turned to us after Saddam fell and after Gaddafi fell and said, why did you do that? We weren't ready for the transition.
But in there, the concern here that I agree, you're right. The one difference, of course, is the role of Iran. And so anything short of Assad leaving becomes a victory for Iran, which is at this point, more than the Sunni Shia sectarian, it's a regional power struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia for who will be the hegemon. And the Iran nuclear deal has only made them more nervous because there's a sense that we've unleashed now Iran even further on the region. How do we reassure them? How do we make them comfortable with a negotiated settlement? Because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the worst outcome wouldn't be Assad staying. It would be a failed state in Syria, which we're pretty much on the way to anyway. And the repercussions of that would be regionally quite devastating. How do we get them on board?
I think the Gulf Arabs deserve to be at the table. They deserve to be involved in this UN process. I don't think they're always as effective as they could be when you get to that big table and the real diplomacy, because I think their position sometimes is a little bit dogmatic, and they don't quite know how to engage on the give and take of, you know, well, maybe this group should be on the B list and we'll decide if they're going to go to the A list or not. The Arab world has tended to look at their partners in the Arab world in kind of black and white terms. So so for now, I see them operating a little bit as an independent variable. You know, we don't know from week to week how much they're going to engage. They are committing on the, you know, on the combat side, in the coalition, et cetera. So I'm not sure we can promise them a happy ending in Syria. I think that is truly, truly beyond America's power to produce. I think that, but I do think the Saudis are becoming, and the Emiratis are becoming more powerful and effective players at the UN level, and that's where I think they can try to shape the outcomes that would be, in their view, stabilizing for the region.
Let's move to Iran. The elections took place that brought a surprise, I thought. I thought Rouhani's election to the council was somewhat significant. And the election of a number of moderates, folks from his point of view as well. The question is, the critics of this election say that it's not really an election because the number of reformers who were ruled out, I mean, the council that makes the decision ultimately, you know, got rid of 90% of the candidates who'd applied to run. Is this an election that represents change? Is it an election that represents a managed change? Or is it an election that actually makes no outcome at all and doesn't mean a whole lot?
Well,
Where
I
would
guess
you be on that?
I would put it in the managed change. I mean, I think that what we see is, these fluctuations. I mean, the Khatami victory, and there was a big cohort of reformers in that parliament in 2005. So we see that it kind of ebbs and flows, but that the trajectory is moving towards very gradual liberalization of a system that is fundamentally non-democratic, okay? I mean, that you've got some democratic practices within a structure that is still not democratic because you have this parallel clerical structure that gets to decide who's a legitimate candidate and who isn't. I think most of the observers believe that these elections are moderately significant for domestic political stability and change in Iran. This is strengthening Rouhani more than people might have anticipated, but probably beneath the threshold of significantly changing Iran's external behavior and foreign policy.
The question would also come that the Iranian regime, since its beginning in 79, has based itself on a revolutionary philosophy. The revolutionary philosophy was confronting the West, confronting the Western powers. They've negotiated a deal with the P5+1 on nuclear power and are now playing in the big leagues with Syria and the negotiations taking place, et cetera. Can they survive being a partner, quote unquote, of the international community, and can they give up the revolutionary philosophy and still have a raison d'etre?
So I think we're now kind of on the beginning of a slippery slope for them, where there will be that friction between, we're different, we're independent, we don't let foreign powers push us around, we love our revolution. And
kind of the choice that Hamas didn't make.
Yeah, correct, yes. So there's still some cohorts that are truly still dedicated to the revolution. And let's remember, Ahmadinejad's victory was kind of revitalizing the revolution by a next generation. So instead of the guys in their late 70s and 80s, you had a younger technocrat generation saying, we still love the revolution. But the other trend is really, really the broad swath of urban educated Iranians want to be back as a respected member of the international community. So now for the supreme leader, I think it's pretty tricky right now. He wants Iran to comply with the agreement. He wants to know what the boundaries are so that he doesn't have to give up all of his revolutionary principles. But there's this other magnetic pull towards diluting those revolutionary principles to be accepted in the international community. So I think that that friction isn't going to go away.
We did a poll in Iran late last year in which we found that when asked what they wanted post P5+1, number one was economic progress. Number two was greater political freedom and civil rights protected. And the very bottom of the list was Iran's involvement in Syria, Iraq, et cetera. Can they do that? That's the question ultimately. Can the regime deliver on that?
We are seeing the regime being worried about casualties in Syria, trying to promise Iranian mothers that they're not going to lose their sons to a war that is not that meaningful to them. They don't care about the survival of Bashar al-Assad. So I do see the regime having to, by a few degrees at least, recalibrate their priorities. And the early evidence from the Obama administration is that the money that has been released from the sanctions relief is being used for domestic reasons. The IRGC is apparently complaining that they expected a little bit of a windfall so that they could do their activities with their non-state actor partners, and that may not be playing out to their satisfaction.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ellen.
Thanks, Jim.
That's all the time we've got. You can check us on our website, Twitter. Twitter is AAIUSA, and our website's aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.